Harrison had been hunting the same stretch of woodland in northern Michigan for over 15 years. He knew every trail, every clearing, every fallen log that could serve as cover. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the chaos of his construction job and find peace in the silence of nature. But that silence would soon become his worst nightmare. It was early November, prime deer season, and Harrison had taken a week off work to really focus on his hunting. He'd set up his tree stand in what he called his lucky spot, a massive oak tree overlooking a natural funnel where deer frequently passed through. The stand was about 20 feet up, giving him a perfect view of the surrounding area while keeping him well hidden. The first 3 days were typical. He'd seen a few does, a couple of young bucks, but nothing worth taking. Harrison was patient though. He learned long ago that rushing things in the woods never paid off. On the fourth morning, he climbed into his stand before sunrise, settling in for what he hoped would be a productive day. As the sun began to filter through the bare branches, Harrison noticed something odd. The woods were completely silent, no birds chirping, no squirrels chattering, no leaves rustling in the wind. Even the insects seemed to have vanished. In all his years of hunting, he'd never experienced such an oppressive lack of sound. At first, he attributed it to the weather. Sometimes, before a storm, wildlife would go quiet and seek shelter. But the sky was clear, and there was barely a breeze. Still, Harrison remained in his stand, figuring the animals would eventually return to their normal patterns. Around 10 in the morning, the silence was broken by a sound that made Harrison's blood run cold. It started as a low humming, almost like someone humming a tune under their breath. But there was something wrong with it. The pitch was too low, too resonant to be human. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees in a way that defied explanation. Harrison gripped his rifle tighter and scanned the forest floor below. The humming continued for several minutes before gradually fading away. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped completely. The oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. Kay considered climbing down and heading back to his truck, but his pride got the better of him. Harrison had never been spooked out of the woods before, and he wasn't about to start now. He forced himself to relax, taking slow, deep breaths to calm his nerves. That's when he saw it, about 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a cluster of pine trees. Something was watching him. At first glance, it looked like a person standing perfectly still. But as Harrison focused his scope in that direction, the details became clearer and more disturbing. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, at least 7 feet in height. Its limbs were elongated and thin, almost skeletal in appearance. What should have been a face was nothing but shadow, a void that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The thing wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, wasn't doing anything that suggested it was alive. It was simply there, watching. Harrison blinked hard, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. When he looked again, the figure was gone. Not walked away, not moved behind another tree. Gone. As if it had never been there at all. His hands were shaking now, and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Harrison tried to rationalize what he'd seen. Maybe it was just a play of shadows and light through the trees. Maybe his mind was creating patterns where none existed. But deep down, he knew what he'd witnessed was real. The humming started again, closer this time, much closer. It seemed to be coming from directly below his tree stand. Harrison looked down, but saw nothing except fallen leaves and forest debris. The sound was getting louder, more intense, vibrating through his chest in a way that made him feel sick. Then he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the base of his tree. But when he looked down, there was nothing there. No disturbed leaves, no visible tracks, just the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. The circling continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Round and round, the invisible presence moved, always just out of sight. Harrison's heart was pounding so hard, he was sure whatever was down there could hear it. Finally, the footsteps stopped directly below him. The humming reached a crescendo that made his teeth ache, and then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Harrison waited, barely breathing, for something to happen. Minutes passed. Then, from somewhere above him, came a voice. It spoke in a whisper that somehow carried clearly through the still air. The words were indistinct, like a conversation heard through water, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. Whatever was speaking wasn't human, couldn't be human. The voice had qualities that human vocal cords simply couldn't produce. That was enough for Harrison. Without bothering to pack his gear properly, he scrambled down from his tree stand, grabbed his rifle, and ran. He crashed through the underbrush, not caring about the noise he was making. Not caring about anything except getting as far away from that place as possible. He didn't stop running until he reached his truck, and even then, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. As he drove away, Harrison looked in his rearview mirror and saw something that made him press harder on the accelerator. Standing at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the shadows, was the tall figure he'd seen earlier. It wasn't moving, wasn't following, but somehow Harrison knew it was watching him leave. He never went back to those woods, and he never told anyone what happened until he wrote to me years later. To this day, Harrison can't explain what he encountered in those woods. He's considered every rational explanation: hallucinations, stress, lack of sleep, carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heater in his hunting cabin, but none of them account for the physical evidence he found. When he finally worked up the courage to retrieve his hunting gear a month later, his tree stand had been completely destroyed, not damaged by weather or animals, but systematically torn apart, with pieces scattered in a perfect circle around the base of the oak tree. And in the soft earth below, there were tracks. Not human, not animal, but something else entirely. Something with too many joints, too many toes, and claws that left gouges in the hard-packed soil. Harrison sold his hunting equipment the next week and took up fishing instead. Kate had always been the outdoorsy type. Growing up in rural Montana, she'd learned to hunt and fish before she could properly ride a bike. Her father had taught her to respect the wilderness, to read the signs that nature provided, and most importantly, to trust her instincts. Those instincts had served her well over the years, keeping her safe in situations where less experienced hunters might have found themselves in trouble. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened during her elk hunting trip in October. Kate had planned a solo hunting expedition to a remote area of the Bitterroot Mountains. Tid was a place she'd hunted before, though not recently. Tia, the terrain was challenging but not dangerous, and the elk population was healthy. She'd secured all the necessary permits and informed her family of her planned route and return date. To Tig, to her chosen camping spot, took most of the first day. Kate set up her tent near a small creek, far enough from any trails to avoid other hunters, but close enough to water to be practical. The area was perfect. Multiple game trails converged nearby, and the wind patterns were favorable for hunting. Her first night passed without incident. Kate woke before dawn, ate a quick breakfast, and headed out to a ridge she'd scouted the previous evening. The morning was crisp and clear, with just enough breeze to mask her scent. Conditions couldn't have been better. She'd been in position for about 2 hours when she heard the first scream. It came from somewhere down in the valley, maybe half a mile away. At first, Kate thought it might be an elk bugling, but the sound was all wrong. Elk bugles have a distinct quality, wild and primitive, but unmistakably animal. This was different. It was high-pitched, almost human, but with an underlying tone that made her skin crawl. The scream echoed off the surrounding mountains before fading into silence. Kate waited, listening carefully, but heard nothing else unusual. After a few minutes, she convinced herself it had been an elk after all, maybe injured, or in distress. About an hour later, she heard it again. This time, it was closer, and there was no mistaking what she was hearing. It was definitely human, or at least something trying very hard to sound human. But there was something wrong with it, something that suggested the vocal cords producing the sound weren't quite the right shape or size. Kate's father had always told her that the woods were full of sounds that could fool you, especially when you were alone and on edge. Rocks falling could sound like footsteps, wind through hollow trees could mimic voices, and stressed animals could produce calls that were almost human-like. She tried to apply this logic to what she was hearing, but her instincts were telling her something different. Tay's screaming continued intermittently throughout the morning, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always with that same unsettling quality. Kate found herself unable to concentrate on hunting. Every few minutes, she'd scan the tree line below, looking for any sign of movement. Around noon, she decided to investigate. Against her better judgment, she left her hunting spot and began making her way down into the valley toward where the sounds seemed to be originating. She moved carefully, stopping frequently to listen and observe. As she got closer to the source, Kate began to notice other things that bothered her. The forest was too quiet. She should have been seeing squirrels, chipmunks, birds, all the small creatures that normally populated these woods. Instead, there was nothing. Even the insects seemed to have disappeared. She found the source of the screaming in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine trees. In the center of the clearing was what looked like a camp, but not the kind any sane person would make. There were bones scattered everywhere. Not just deer bones or elk bones, but what looked like the remains of multiple different animals, all mixed together. Some were arranged in crude patterns, others were simply strewn about randomly. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of decay and something else Kate couldn't identify. But what really caught her attention were the trees surrounding the clearing. Every single one had been stripped of bark from about 4 feet to 8 feet off the ground, not by any tool Kate recognized, but by something with claws. Long, deep gouges spiraled around each trunk, and some of the marks were still weeping sad, indicating they were recent. Kate was backing away from the clearing when she heard the scream again, much closer than before. It seemed to come from directly behind her, but when she spun around, nothing was there. Her heart was racing now, and every instinct she had was screaming at her to run. She tried to move quietly, but panic was setting in. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every rustling leaf sounded like something stalking her. The screaming continued, sometimes ahead of her, sometimes behind, as if whatever was making the sound was circling her, hurting her in a specific direction. Kate realized she was lost. In her panic, she'd gotten turned around and was no longer sure which direction led back to her camp. The sun was starting to set, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. She needed to find shelter soon or risk hypothermia. That's when she saw the cabin. It was small and looked abandoned, but it was solid shelter. Kate approached cautiously, rifle ready. The windows were boarded up, and the door was hanging open on rusted hinges. She called out, but there was no answer. Inside, the cabin was a mess. Furniture was overturned, and there were more bones scattered across the floor. But it was dry and would provide protection from the cold. Kate barricaded the door as best she could and settled in to wait for morning. She didn't sleep that night. Screaming continued outside, sometimes right next to the cabin walls. Several times she heard what sounded like claws scraping against the wooden exterior. Whatever was out there knew she was inside, and it wasn't happy about the barrier between them. Around 3 in the morning, the sounds stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the screaming had been. Kate waited, hardly daring to breathe, for something to happen. Then she heard the voice. It was calling her name. Not shouting it, but speaking it, conversively, almost lovingly. The voice sounded like her father's, but wrong somehow. The inflection was off, like someone who had heard the voice, but didn't quite understand how human speech worked. Kate The voice called, "Kate, come outside. It's safe now. Come outside, Kate." She gripped her rifle tighter and tried to block out the sound, but the voice was persistent, calling her name over and over, sometimes sounding like her father, sometimes like her mother, once even like her childhood dog's bark formed into syllables. The voice continued until dawn. Soon as the first rays of sunlight penetrated the boarded windows, everything went quiet. Kate waited another hour before carefully removing the barricade and stepping outside. The area around the cabin looked like a war zone. The ground was torn up as if something large had been pacing back and forth all night. Deep claw marks scored the cabin walls, and several of the boards she'd used to barricade the door were snapped in half. But most disturbing were the tracks. They started at the edge of the clearing and circled the cabin dozens of times. They looked almost human, but the proportions were all wrong. The feet were too long, the stride too wide, and there were claw marks at the end of each toe print. Kate didn't waste time investigating further. She oriented herself using the sun and began hiking back toward her campsite. It took her most of the day to find it, and when she did, she discovered that her tent had been completely shredded. Her supplies were scattered throughout the area, and her sleeping bag was hanging from a tree branch 30 feet off the ground. She packed what she could salvage and hiked out that same day, not stopping until she reached her truck. Kate never returned to that area, and she's never hunted alone since. She told her family that she'd had equipment failure and decided to cut the trip short, but she never mentioned what really happened. Even now, years later, Kate occasionally hears her name being called when she's alone in the woods. It's always in a voice she recognizes, always someone she trusts, and it always makes her pack up and head home immediately. Mike and his brother Eric had been planning their hunting trip to northern Wisconsin for months. It was an annual tradition, 2 weeks in November, just the two of them, camping in the deep woods and hunting white-tailed deer. They'd been doing it for over a decade, and it was the highlight of both their years. This particular year, they decided to try a new area. Eric had gotten permission from a local landowner to hunt a large tract of private land that supposedly hadn't been hunted in years. The owner, an elderly man named Henderson, had seemed reluctant to give permission, but eventually agreed after Eric assured him they were experienced hunters who would respect the land. The only condition Henderson had given them was strange. Don't hunt after dark, and don't investigate any sounds you can't immediately identify. When Eric had asked why, Henderson had just shaken his head and said some places were better left alone after sunset. Mike and Eric had laughed about it on the drive up. Henderson was probably just worried about them accidentally shooting someone's livestock or getting lost in the dark. They were experienced enough to handle whatever the woods might throw at them. Their first few days were incredibly successful. The deer population was healthy, and they were seeing animals constantly. Mike managed to bag a nice 8-point buck on the second day, and Eric got a doe on the third. They were having the best hunting trip they'd had in years. It wasn't until the fourth night that things started to go wrong. They were sitting around their campfire, cleaning their rifles and planning the next day's hunt, when they heard something moving in the woods nearby. It sounded large, definitely bigger than a deer, and it was moving deliberately through the underbrush rather than fleeing from their presence. Both brothers grabbed their flashlights and peered into the darkness beyond their fire's light. The sounds stopped immediately, as if whatever was out there knew it was being observed. They waited for several minutes, listening carefully, but heard nothing else. Mike suggested it might have been a bear, which wouldn't be unusual for the area. They secured their food supplies and went to bed without giving it much more thought. The next night, it happened again. This time, the sounds were closer and lasted longer. Whatever was out there seemed to be circling their camp, staying just beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. When they called out, asking if anyone was there, the sound stopped immediately. On the third night, they were ready. Both brothers positioned themselves on opposite sides of their camp with high-powered flashlights and their rifles loaded. Ow! When the sounds started again, they coordinated their response, simultaneously illuminating the forest from two different angles. What they saw made them both freeze in terror. About 30 yards from their camp, caught in the overlapping beams of their flashlights, was something that shouldn't exist. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent in places where there shouldn't be joints. Its skin was pale and seemed to reflect their light in an unnatural way, almost glowing. But it was the face that really got to them. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. The features were a grotesque parody of humanity, as if someone had tried to sculpt a human face from memory, but had gotten all the proportions wrong. The eyes were too large, too dark, and they reflected light, like an animal's. The mouth was too wide, stretching almost from ear to ear. The thing stood perfectly still for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. But without any visible movement, it was gone. Not running away, not ducking behind trees, simply gone, as if it had never been there at all. Mike and Eric spent the rest of the night back to back, rifles ready, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally came, they were exhausted and on edge. They considered packing up and leaving, but their pride got the better of them. They'd never been run off by anything before, and they weren't about to start now. That day's hunting was a disaster. Neither brother could concentrate, and they found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders. The woods seemed different somehow, too quiet, too still. They didn't see a single deer all day, which was unusual given how active the population had been. As evening approached, they made a decision. They would pack up and leave first thing in the morning. Whatever was happening here wasn't worth the risk, but they never got the chance to leave. That night, the creature didn't stay hidden in the woods. It came right into their camp. Mike woke up to the sound of something rummaging through their supplies. His first thought was that a raccoon or bear had gotten into their food, but when he opened his eyes, he saw something that made his blood freeze. The pale creature was crouched next to their cooler, holding a package of lunch meat in its impossibly long fingers. It was examining the package with an almost childlike curiosity, turning it over and over as if trying to understand what it was. Mike tried to wake his brother without making any sudden movements, but Eric was already awake, staring at the creature with wide, terrified eyes. They watched as it opened the package with claws that were far too sharp to be natural and began eating the meat with obvious relish. When it finished, the creature looked directly at them. Its oversized eyes seemed to bore right through them, and Mike had the disturbing impression that it was studying them the same way it had studied the lunch meat, evaluating them, considering them. Then it smiled. The expression was so wrong, so fundamentally inhuman, that both brothers nearly screamed. The creature's mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for any earthly predator. It held that horrible smile for several seconds before standing up. As it rose to its full height, Mike realized just how large it was, even hunched over their supplies. It had seemed tall, but standing upright, it was easily 8 feet in height. The creature looked at them for another moment, then walked calmly out of their camp and disappeared into the woods. It moved with a fluid, inhuman grace that was disturbing to watch. Neither brother slept for the rest of the night, sat with their backs to the dying fire, rifles across their laps, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, they packed their gear in record time and hiked back to their truck without speaking. It wasn't until they were driving away that Eric finally broke the silence. "That wasn't an animal," he said quietly. Mike nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing. Whatever they'd encountered wasn't any known species of wildlife. It had demonstrated intelligence, curiosity, and worst of all, a clear interest in them as potential prey. They drove straight to Henderson's house to return his key and thank him for the use of his land. When Henderson saw their faces, he just nodded knowingly. "You met it?" he said. It wasn't a question. Eric asked what it was, but Henderson just shook his head. "Some things are better left unnamed," he said. "I should have been more firm about you boys not hunting there. That land has been in my family for generations, and we've learned it's best to leave certain parts of it alone." When Mike pressed him for more information, Henderson reluctantly explained that his family had been dealing with the creature for decades. It seemed to be territorial, claiming certain areas of the forest as its own. As long as people didn't camp overnight in those areas, it generally left them alone. But anyone who spent the night in its territory was fair game. Henderson's grandfather had lost 2 hunting dogs to the creature back in the 1940s. His father had seen it multiple times, but had been smart enough never to confront it. Henderson himself had encountered it once as a young man and had sworn never to hunt that section of his property again. The creature seemed to be intelligent enough to understand boundaries. It didn't venture onto the parts of Henderson's land that were regularly used by humans, and the family didn't intrude on its territory. It was an uneasy truce that had lasted for generations. Mike and Eric never spoke about what they'd experienced to anyone else. They continued their annual hunting trips, but chose different locations, always making sure to research the history of any land they planned to camp on. Years later, Mike happened to be in the area on business and decided to drive past Henderson's property. T was shocked to see that the entire tract of land was for sale. When he called the real estate agent to inquire, he learned that Henderson had passed away the previous winter. But what really caught Mike's attention was a note in the listing description. Property sold as is. Buyer assumes all risks. Seller makes no warranties regarding unusual wildlife activity. Night hunting strictly prohibited. Mike wondered if the new owners would heed that warning, or if they'd dismiss it as the paranoid ramblings of rural folk. He hoped they'd be smart enough to take it seriously. Some warnings he'd learned were worth listening to.